Before we start learning today, I just want to dedicate this shir Le'ilui Nishmosoi of Harav Reb Mordechai ben Reb Yeshua Menachem Mendel Weber. The Yortzeit is Tes Kislev Habu Oleno Letoivo. I think it's Shabbos is going to be Tes Kislev. Reb Mordechai was the late father of our dear friend Shiabod L'chaim Toivim, Reb Eli Weber. Eli Weber is one of the people I most love and admire, but he doesn't like it when I sing his praise, so I won't. I'll just dedicate the shir today, Le'ilui Nishmos of Reb Mordechai. Reb Mordechai used to come to my Thursday night shir every week for quite a while. And he was a Talmud Chacham, a lover of Torah, a very, very special person, and Baruch Hashem, he raised a beautiful family. So the Torah we learn today should be Le'ilui Nishmos of Reb Mordechai ben Reb Yeshua Menachem Mendel Weber. He should be a Melitz Yosher for his wife, for his children, for the entire family, and they should all know Simchas and Nachas. So this week we read Parshas Vayetze, and the sugya we will be discussing today is a fascinating sugya, and sometimes I just look for an opportunity and some connection, some kesher with the weekly parsha, even though it's not really one of the fundamental teachings of the parsha. So today we will be discussing a fascinating sugya which affects so many different sources in Shas, and that is the sugya of Umdena. How do I translate Umdena into English? Most of the people listening to my shir, even if they listen to the shir in English, are Talmidei Chachamim, and I don't feel I need to translate every word, but loosely translated, Umdena would be evaluation, assessment, maybe assumption. So the sugya of Umdena has three different aspects which we will explain just in a few moments. But we always start off with the weekly parsha. So Lavan tells Yaakov, Lo ya'osu keim bimkoimenu, lo seis hatzeiro lefnei habechiro. Lavan cheated Yaakov. Yaakov thought he's marrying Rachel, and in the morning he becomes aware that his wife is not really Rachel, but rather Leah. And Lavan tries to explain, and he says, well, this is against our minig. We don't give a younger sister before an older one. And it's interesting. Lavan is the one that said that in this week's parsha, but the poskim bring this as a halachic ruling. So in Shalosh Teshuvos Minchas Osher, there actually is a tshuva halacha l'maisa in which I dealt directly with this question. What are the circumstances in which it is justified to let a younger sibling marry before an older one? And many times I try to explain to people, this is not halacha l'Moshe Messinai. And in our day and age, many times it's not justified to keep all the other children back because an older one somehow has difficulty in finding his zivug. So I definitely agree. If your older child is 20 and your younger one is 18, what's the rush? What's the rush? But in many families, an older child would be 24, 25, or 29, or 30, and in those cases, there is no justification of preventing the younger ones from finding their zivug. But that's not the topic we will be discussing today. I just wanted to point out an interesting phenomenon. It is Lavan that uses that as an alibi to explain to Yaakov why he cheated him, but that is brought in the poskim. What I want to speak about is Tosfos and Kedushin Nun Beis Omed Aleph. Tosfos brings a story, Maaseh Shehoyo. Bnoi shel Rav Oshaya Halevi wanted to marry a daughter of Oshir Echad. Well, seems to be an interesting story. The son of Rav Oshaya Halevi, whom we don't really know anything about, but he was in the time of the Bani Tosfos, and he wanted to marry the daughter of a rich man. And Tosfos doesn't say who was that rich man. Obviously, it's not so important who he was. The fact is, he was a rich man, and obviously he wanted a rich mechuten. So, and there were two minors, little girls. Al pi halacha, if a person wants to be mekadesh ktano, he needs to do it through her father. So he gave the father a ring, and he said, Bitchu mikudeshes li, but he didn't specify which daughter. So, what is the halacha? Rabbeinu Tam ruled, and this is really a novel ruling, and he said, because lo also came bimkomenu losis atzeiru lefnei abechira, we should assume that the kavanah was the oldest daughter, and we could rely halachically on that assumption. Rabbi Nachem Meyuni disagreed, and he says, we're dealing with erva, we're dealing with chasas eishes ish, we're dealing with a chashash achois isha, and therefore we cannot rely on umdena. And that is the fundamental bechloikis between Baalei HaTosfos. Now, Rabbeinu Tam's ruling is a three-phased ruling, or three different stages. Rabbeinu Tam insisted, even though there were no shidduchim, they did not previously specify which of my daughters do you want to be Mekadesh. Afal Piken, the shit of Rabbeinu Tam is based on the halacha lo also came bimkomenu. We should assume that what they had in mind was adherence to halacha. So obviously the oldest daughter is the one that he was mekadesh. Rabbeinu Tam goes on and says, even if you would disagree with my ruling, but if they did previously speak and specify which of his daughters he wants as a wife, then definitely we could rely on that umdena, even though B'shas HaKiddushin he did not specify, and all he said was B'tchum HaKadeshus li. Phase number 3, even if you will disagree with this psak, but if they had a formal shidduch and she was engaged, now let me just make it clear, engagement is not Kiddushin. Engagement is what we define halachically as shidduchim. If she was engaged, then definitely we assume that is the one. This story is brought in greater length in Agos Memoni Yosel Chasishas Perik Tes Halacha Aleph, and we have the whole story. Magid Mishnah Perik Tes Mishas Halacha Ches. He brings the story as well, and the chiddush we find in the Magid Mishnah is that the Beis Din of Rabbeinu Tam disagreed with his ruling, his own Beis Din. Rabbeinu Tam was Mekel, and as Beis Din said, no, we cannot rely on assumptions when we're dealing with Chashash Erva. So this is the story, and that is the springboard. That is our point of departure in today's Shiur. We will be discussing the concept of Umdena. I wrote about this sugya, Minchasosha Shemois Simin Mem Dalad Madura Kamo. Minchasosha Bereshis Pehei Madura Basa, and the new edition. For the time being, all we have out is Bereshis. I hope in the coming few months we'll have the entire set, Madura Basa, the new edition. So in Madura Basa, Bereshis Pehei, there's an additional siman about Umdena. So let me just first of all make the fundamentals clear, Kidarkeinu, the Yesodis, and then we will deal with questions we never dealt with before. In Shas, we find two different types of Umdena. I would say 2.5. And in the next 15 minutes, you will understand why I say 2.5. Two different ideas, two different concepts. Both are called Umdena, Befi Chazal, but they're not the same. Umdena number 1 is what we call in modern legal language circumstantial evidence. And in the modern world, sometimes it is all we have, and it is all law enforcement and the courts need to deal with. When a person murders another, usually he isn't miyached eidim, and he says, atem eidai. Even in business dealings, I'm an Av Beis Din for more than 20 years. I don't recall one tick that we decided upon with kusher eidim, with proper testimony. Because when deals are made, when contracts are signed, who's usually there? Family members, business partners, people that definitely are either kroivim or a negei b'davar, the posel eidus. And therefore, sometimes all we have is circumstantial evidence. A disproportionate number of anshe mishpat come to my shiurim. I don't know why. Judges, prominent lawyers, and some of the judges discuss the cases they deal with me, and they seek out my opinion and my advice from the Torah standpoint. And I remember a case, one of the major, best judges in Israel discussed with me. A person was killed in a stairwell, murdered in a stairwell. And the investigators found fingerprints on a light bulb in that stairwell. And obviously somebody took care that the light shouldn't go on. And the light bulb was slightly turned to the left, so it didn't go on. Those fingerprints on the light bulb tied him to the crime. Now, the police couldn't say he was the one that murdered, but he was an accomplice. He was part of the conspiracy, and that in itself is a grave crime. So that is an example of Umdena, circumstantial evidence. So in Chazal we find 3 different cases of this type of Umdena, circumstantial evidence. What are the 3? Shavuos Lamed Daled, Sanhedrin Lamed Zayin, Bava Basra Tzadik Gimel. Gomal ha'oichare bein hagamalim. There's a caravan of camels. One of the camels went berserk, and he is violent, and he's kicking right and left, obviously a camel in heat. And right next to him, a camel died, and he died from a wound. It's obvious somebody kicked him. So it's a machlokes Ravacha v'Chachamim. Ravacha says, well, it's obvious which camel killed the other, and therefore the owner of that violent camel needs to compensate the owner of the camel that was killed. That is niskei mamoin. Chachamim say, no, we don't have real evidence. There is no testimony. There is no edom. We don't rely on a umdena in monetary issues. Machlokes Ravacha v'Chachamim. And then the Gemara brings the famous story of Reb Shimon ben Shotach. Reb Shimon ben Shotach tells the story. I saw one person chasing the other with a dagger in his hand, and they went into a chorva. I ran right after them, but I was one moment too late. What I saw was a terrible sight. A man with a mortal wound, thrashing about, gasping his last breaths, and the man holding the dagger was bloody, and blood was dripping from the dagger. And Reb Shimon ben Shotach tells the murderer, I know exactly what happened, but I can do nothing about it, because al pishnayim edem yokum dova, there is no testimony. And nobody disagrees with Reb Shimon ben Shotach. And the Rambam writes, Dinei nefoshois, we need testimony, and we never rely on a umdena b'dinei nefoshois. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Every reasonable person, if he would see exactly what Reb Shimon ben Shotach saw, that would be enough to understand who killed whom. But Dina Nefoshes, it is not enough. But Dina Momenis, it's a machlokes Ravacha v'Chachamim. Umdena number 3, and this would be a surprise to many. Somewhat similar to Umdena number 2. To the story of Reb Shimon ben Shotach. 2 people, healthy, strong, sound, walked into a room. We walked in after them. One has a bloody wound on his back, and it's obvious it's a tooth wound. Somebody bit him on the back. That is a umdena. But that is even a more overwhelming umdena, because it is impossible for a person to bite his own back. Human beings usually don't have the necks of giraffes, so a person cannot possibly bite his own back. And they were the only 2 people in the room. So isn't it obvious what happened? Tosfos twice in Shas, Shavuos Lamed Daled Amud Beis and Sanhedrin Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph writes, this umdena would be sufficient even for Dina Nefoshes. Why is that? In the story of Shimon ben Shotach, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. But scientifically there is a possibility. How unlikely it would seem. There is a possibility that the person that was killed took that dagger, committed suicide, killed himself. And the one that was chasing him took that dagger after the other party killed himself. Unlikely. Why was he chasing him with a knife in his hand? Unlikely, but possible. But it is impossible for a man to have a wound on his back, a bite wound, if these were the only two people in the room. Toises maintains that level of Umdena would be sufficient even in Din Nefoshes. Rambam doesn't seem so. The Rambam twice. Hilchas Sanedrin Perikhof Halacha Aleph. Sefer HaMitzvahs Lotas Ereish Tzaddik. The Rambam writes, Din Nefoshes, we don't rely on any Umdena. And the Rambam says it's a Gezeres HaKosav. We learn from the Posek, No kivet Tzaddik ale taharog. We cannot interpret this Posek literally. It's a Milsa de Pshita. How could we kill a man that is a no kivet Tzaddik? The Rambam's interpretation is, we never rely on circumstantial evidence. And the Rambam has such a powerful line. It's interesting whether the modern legal establishment would agree to that assumption, but the Rambam writes, it is better to let 1,000 criminals free and not kill one innocent person. And that is why the Torah takes away the authority of a Beis Din to rely on circumstantial evidence when we're dealing with Din Nefoshes. L'chorah, the Rambam would say, no Umdena is enough in Din Nefoshes. But maybe not. Because the Umdena of Neshicha Begaboy, which is in Shavuos Memvav, maybe it's more than an Ivnan. It is knowledge. It is something we know, because it is impossible for anything else to have transpired. We aren't choshesh that an angel came out of the sky to bite a man's back. So these are the fundamentals. How do we paskin by Din Momenes? Ravacha or Chachoma, Mechloikes Rambam in Rosh. Rambam Hilches Nizkei Mamoin. Rambam Paskins. Perek Ches, Halacha Yudalad, Chachomim, Gomer Oicha Ben Agmalim. We are not Machayev the Bala Gomer. That is also the opinion of Shulchan Aruch Siman Tov Ches. Rosh, 4 different shuvas. Klal Samaches, Klal Ayin Ches, Klal Ayin Tes, Klal Kuv Zayin. Many sources, Shuvas Arosh, the Rosh says, we do decree Din Momenes al Pi Umdena. So, we have so much material to discuss today, so I can't really elaborate. We need to move forward. So obviously, this is a Mechloikes Rambam in Rosh, and it's also a Mechloikes in the great Poskim Lador saying, do we rely on Umdena by Momenes Aloch Alamais Elahoitzi Moment or not? By Din Nefoshes, no. Everything we discussed up to this point deals with one type of Umdena, circumstantial evidence. Umdena number 2 is the way we evaluate Das B'nei Adam. The way we assume what people mean when they say certain things, when they sign certain documents, when they do certain acts. And this type of Umdena also has several different sources. When a person says to a shaliach, K'toyev get le'ishti, the shliach is authorized to write a get, but he has no authorization to give that get, because the person did not say kitvu itnu. He made a shliach to write a get and not to give that get, because sometimes a person wants to have a get. If he decides to divorce, he doesn't want it to take time, he wants to get over with it. But the fact that he asked a shliach to write a get doesn't necessarily mean that he decided to give a get, to divorce his wife. He wants to have the get ready. However, if a person is being walked to the gallows, and he knows that these are the last moments of his life, and he shouts out, Kizvu get le'ishti, we assume that he means kitvu utenu. He knows that he's going to die. Obviously, he wants to spare his wife from yibum, from chalitza. And that is why we assume he means kitvu vitenu. Why didn't he say tenu? Well, he's not in the state of mind that we could expect him to see, to express himself thoroughly. And Reb Shemesh Azuri says, even when a person is desperately ill, is terminally ill, is on his deathbed, we assume the same. When he said kizvu, he probably means kizvu vitnu, and that is why we not only write the get, we have the authorization the authority to give the get. And the Gemara calls that Umdena, which means we try to go into the mind of a man. What does he mean when he says Kisvu, get leishti? And the Gemara compares this to a shchiv mara. If he gave away all his nechosim, that is a matna shchiv mara, and if he gets better, he could retract. If he just made a partial transaction, he cannot retract. Umdena, a koisav kol nechosav leishtoi, loy asoa elo apetropos. Umdena. That is in Gittin Samachei, Ksubis Nunhei, Bava Basra Kufmen Vava Midbeis, 3 sugyas. And I gave a few examples of this type of umdena, a few examples of that type of umdena. Umdena number 3, which in the Gemara is not called umdena, but it is a third concept. Rambam Perik Chovdana Dalocha Aleph in Hilches Sanhedrin, Choyshe Mishpot, Tezvov Sif Hei. The Rambam writes, Yesh lo ledayin lodun bedina momenes al pi dova shechozik beliboy vedater meskemes olav shehu emes. The Rambam writes, a dayan, a judge, could rely on personal conviction. No testimony, no hard proof, not even circumstantial evidence, but personal conviction. And personal conviction is based on 2 different examples. And obviously the source of the Rambam is a Gemon Ksubis Pehei. Rava was a dayan, the great Amoira Rava. And a person comes with a shtar, Ed Echad, Chayiv Shavua. Omre lei bas Rav Chizda. It's an interesting Gemara. The daughter of Rav Chizda happened to be Rava's wife. But when Rava related to his wife, he called her the daughter of Rav Chizda. Probably a reflection of the great kavod Rava had to his father-in-law. So Rava said, my wife is so great not because she's a Neishes Chova, not because she's my wife, but because she's a Bas Talmud Chochem. So Bas Rav Chizda tells Rava, I know this person, the one that's Chayiv Shviyah. He's not reliable, he's not trustworthy, you can't believe him even if he swears. And Rava relies on his wife, and that is the concept of hepech shavua. He demands a shavua from the other party. So Rava relies on his wife, and he was asked, she's posela edus, and Rava says, Kimli bigavo de lo mishakra. I know her. She's my wife, and I know she will never, ever lie. And I believe her. And that's what Rava did. And the Rambam takes halacha out of that Gemara. It's not just a story, it's halacha l'maisa. A dayan could rely on personal conviction. That's not a umdena. It's a totally subjective umdena. And the Rambam expands that Gemara and he says, and this is very common in Beis Din, a dayan just listens to the 2 parties. He listens to the arguments of the claimant, of the defendant, and he has a very clear feeling. Who's right and who's wrong, who's the liar and who is speaking the truth. Cannot prove it, but it is clear to him, based on his experience, based on his wisdom, that Rambam says a dayan could rely. That is different than the first 2 umdenas. The first 2 umdenas are general umdenas. Circumstantial evidence would be obvious to every reasonable person. The same umdena number 2. We try to evaluate, to understand, what do people mean? So one of the stories in Bava Basra about the second umdena, which is based on trying to analyze what people mean. Person had 1 ben yochid, and he took a faraway trip, a journey into the desert, and he was notified that his son died. He wrote away his entire inheritance to tzedakah, or to a third party. And then, to his great relief, his son opens the door and he's home. And the person retracts and he said, I would never give away whatever I have. If I would know my beloved son is alive, he's the Yodesh. I would never give it away to others. The only reason I wrote off my nechosim is because I was told and I believed my son is no longer alive. The Gemara says he could retract. That's a clear umdena. A person wouldn't right away, whatever he has, if he would know that his son is alive. And we do know that he thought, that he assumed, that he believed that his son is dead. So those are the examples, and those are general umdenas. Every reasonable person would reach the same conclusion. This Rambam, this Halacha Choshen Mishpat Tezvav is totally subjective. And that is why it is very, very limited. Ein moitziyen momoin al pi das hadayin. And the Nesivis makes that clear in Sif Kotten Beis. And it's clear from the Gemara. All the examples we find in Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, and the Gemara are not lahoitzi momoin. They're only on the fringes. So those are the three fundamental umdenas. And I already discussed the validity of umdenas. Circumstantial evidence is valid by moment according to the Rosh, according to the Rambam, no. By Nefoshes, definitely not. However, circumstantial evidence that has no other possibility, according to Tosfos, would be valid even by Nefoshes. When we're dealing with Umdena in the mind of man, it is relevant even by Dovish Be'erva. One of the examples is a get. We're dealing with an Eishes Ish. So obviously the Umdena assessing what people mean is more convincing than circumstantial evidence. Number 3, subjective conviction of the Dayan has very little weight. Only lahachzek, lahafoy shvua, but we don't really rely on that. What's the story of Shlomo HaMelech told in Sefer Malachim, Malachim Aleph Perek Gimel? So there's an interesting Gemara, Rosh Hashanah Chof Aleph Amud Beis. Chof Aleph Amud Beis, the Gemara says about Shlomo HaMelech. Bikesh Shlomo loden dinim shebeleiv yotza baskol al pi shnayim edim yokum dor. Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest of men, wanted to rely on his own personal conviction, dinim shebeleiv, and a voice came out of the heavens, a baskol, no, 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 you don't have the authority to do so. Al pi shnayim edim yokum dor. Maratz Chayes writes, and I think it's Divrei Nevuos, it's just a guess, not more than a guess. Maratz Chayes writes, I think that story happened after Mishpat Shlomo. So the famous story in Sefer Malachim, Malachim Aleph Perek Gimel, when everybody saw how wise Shlomo was. So the famous story of two women. They came with a child, a newborn baby. And the woman argued. Each of them said, this is my baby. Shlomo looks right and he looks left. They both argue with full force, this is my baby. So Shlomo HaMelech says, bring a knife. We'll cut the baby in half and each of them will get half of it. I assume Shlomo HaMelech quoted the first Mishnah in Bava Metzia. Shnayim oichzem etalas, zeh ha'makulu sheli v'zeh ha'makulu sheli. Zeh yesh b'she'ena poches mechetze, zeh yesh b'she'ena b'poches mechetze, v'chayolken. We cut it in half and each one gets half. So one of the two women says, okay, I agree. The other screamed and he said, Chas v'sholom, I don't want to hurt the child. Let her have the baby. Shlomo HaMelech said, that is the mother. So the Maratz Chayes says, after that story, Shlomo HaMelech was warned by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you cannot rely on umdenes, only Edom. I disagree with the Maratz Chayes. I mean, it's just a guess, not more than a guess. I think in the story of Shlomo HaMelech, that was sound judgment. I don't think that... Is this a new form of Umdena? So, Minchas Osha Bereishis, Madura Tiyona Siman Pei. It's a fascinating siman. I encourage everybody to go through the siman. I dealt with all the different facets about Mishpat Shlomo. What is it? It's not Dina Momenis. There is no monetary ownership of a mother of her child. It's not Dina Nefoshes. Yuchsin is only indirectly. What was it about? I think in the case of Shlomo HaMelech, there was no other way. So there are no Edom. So what is Shlomo HaMelech expected to do? To say, I take the child into custody, I'm going to be the babysitter till you bring Edom, and if they will not find Edom, so I have no criticism of Mishpat Shlomo. I don't think the Maratz Chayes has anything, that Gemara has anything to do. But what we do learn from the Gemara is the limited validity of a Dayan's personal conviction. After all was said, what I want to discuss after this lengthy introduction. So the poskim deal at great length, and all the sources that I quoted, Umdena by Momenes, Umdena by Nefoshes. How about Umdena by Dovisha Be'erva, and even more important, Umdena by Isur Veheter? There is room to argue that we rely on Umdena only when Beis Din has the obligation to deal out justice, punishment, to have a just and decent society. And therefore, by Dina Momenes or Dina Nefoshes, when cases become before Beis Din needs tools. It is impossible that the only tool is Eidim. I mentioned before, 20 years sitting in Beis Din, we never had kosher Eidim. And when we're dealing with criminal activity, whether it's murder or Dina Nefoshes, there will never be Eidim. Because when Moshe Rabbeinu killed the Mitzri, what does the Pasuk say? V'yifin koi v'choi v'yarki einish. So when you're killing a person, you look around. And the same when you commit any crime, whether it's Chil Shabbos or Erev. So basically tools, and that is where Umdena comes in. But when we're dealing with Isser Veheter, why would we give any validity to Umdena when we're dealing with a Suffolk Isser? So this is a fascinating question. And how about Dovish B'Yarva? Dovish B'Yarva is not monetary issues, it's not punishment, but it's still something which Beis Din needs to take upon himself. This is not Isser Veheter in a private home, Ed Echod Ne'eman B'Yisurim. Ein Dovish B'Yarva Puchas Mishnayim. And it is upon Beis Din to decide which woman could get married and which could not get married. So how about Umdena Dovish B'Yarva? We started off the Shiur with Umdena Dovish B'Yarva. That's the story of Rabbeinu Tam. The son of Reb Oshaya Halevi married the daughter of a rich person. It seems to be, when you read the Rishonim, that he cared less about, is it Rachel or Leah? He just wanted a daughter of a rich person. Well, sometimes that happens. It shouldn't happen, but it does sometimes. So that's the Machlokes Rabbeinu Tam, and the others. Source number 2 and 3 are Even Ezer Mem Beis, Sif Aleph and Sif Dalet. The Darke Moshe, Sif Koten Dalet, Simon Mem Beis writes, Eide Kiddushin, and I always tell Eide Kiddushin when I'm a Sadi Kiddushin, and I tell it to the Chosin as well. You need to actually see the Chosin putting the ring on the Kana's finger. Look and see, and you need to hear the Chosin say, Arei Mekudeshes. And they always make space for the Eidim, because the Ramu brings a Machlokes Rishonim. What is the din? When Eidim were standing there, they saw the Chosin holding the ring, and then a bird chirped, and they looked up at the tree, and when they looked down again, the ring was on the finger of the Kala. They did not actually see the very act of the Chosin putting the ring on the Kala's finger. And the Ramo quotes the Rashbo, Eino Mikudeshes. That is Kiddushin Beli Eidim, and it's invalid. Machlokes Rishonim, but that's the psak of the Ramo. Going back to Sif Aleph, what I quoted the Sif Dalet. Sif Aleph is Kiddushay Schoik. This happens all the time, and it's very, very disturbing. You know, in Hasidic communities it doesn't happen because boys and girls don't mix, don't mingle. They barely see each other, and there is more seriousness. Maybe a drop of more Yiras, I don't know how to put it. But in more modern circles, that happens all the times when boys and girls play around, and a boy says jokingly, Arei Mikudeshes li, and he gives something to the girl, and then, 5 years down the line, when the girl needs to get married, she comes and says, 5 years ago we were playing around, we were fooling around, and a friend told me, Arei Mikudeshes li. The Ramos says, we do not rely on any Umdena by Kedushei Schoik. And whenever a boy tells a girl, Arei Mikudeshes li, and he gives her anything, we need a get. Today, that would be tragic. It would be unacceptable. It would be tragic. So many girls would need a get, and then they cannot marry a kohen. and they would have a din of a grusha. And so I think every Rav in his community, every parent needs to explain to his children, this is not a joke, and you don't make jokes about Kiddushin. In Tshuvas Mechasosha, there are a few Tshuvas that regarding Kiddush's Choik. Most of the times we are Mekel, and we find room Lakula. But the Rama says, and that's Maram Rutenberg, and the Rama quotes Maram Rutenberg, we do not rely on any Umdena when it's a Dover Shebe'erva, when it's a Chashash Koris. No Umdenas. So we have 3 Psukim in Shulchan Aruch. Lamed Zayin Tes Zayin regarding Rabbeinu Tam. We do not rely on Umdena to define which of the 2 daughters is the one that got the Kiddushin. We do not rely on Umdena by Kiddush's Choik, and the Edom need to actually see. We cannot assume. A moment ago the Tabas was in the hand of the Chosin. A moment later it's on the finger of the Kala. What happened? Isn't it obvious? Might be obvious. But we do not rely on Umdena by Dover Shebe'erva. Now, there's a fascinating tshuva in Rabbi Kiva Eiger, Madurat Inyonis Mesamech Tes. And it's such a surprise to see that 200 years ago, not 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, some people still were Mekadesh Ektano, Al Yedei Ovio. Today, nobody would do that. Anybody that would do that would be considered a criminal. You would be taken to jail, I don't know what. But 200 years ago, there's a story of a person that was Mekadesh Ektan Al Yedei Ovio. Almost the same story as Rabbeinu Tam with Rabbi Menachem Eyuni. And Rabbi Kiva Eiger has such a powerful argument, but the Gemara does say, "Hamakadosh b'toy stam eno begeres b'chlal lo yishov kenish mitzvah derami alei v'ovid mitzvah deroi rami alei." So we do find an umdin in the Gemara when a person has 2 daughters, an older daughter and a younger daughter. We assume that he was makaber condition for the daughter that is dependent on him and not the one that is already independent. So Rabbi Kiva Eiger writes, and the Chazon Ish writes the same, and these were 2 of the greatest Achronim. My Talmidim know how I feel about Rabbi Kiva Eiger and the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish Semenum Beis Eben Ezer. Fundamentally, Umdena is valid in every area of the Torah. Fundamentally, we rely on Umdena Ba'erva. The problem is only, Umdena is something which is so relative and so ill-defined and so fuzzy. The moment we say a Beis Din could rely on Umdena, there are no limits, there are no boundaries. Each Beis Din would define in a different way what is considered a valid Umdena. So I just want to prove why I think the Chazon Ish and Rabbi Kiva Eiger are 100% right. I quoted the Rambam before. We learned from the Posek Nokev Tzadik Al Ta'arik that Loi Azlina Bosa Umdena Bedina Nefoshes. If we need Gzeres HaKosav Bedina Nefoshes, that means, if not Gzeres HaKosav, we would rely on Umdena even by Dina Nefoshes. Kal V'chomer, any other area of Torah. Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin was the Godel of America, till the star of Rav Moshe Feinstein lighted up the world. And I'm a great admirer of Rav Henkin. For some reason, I don't have his form, which I should. So I don't know whether this tshuva is reprinted in his form, but in Oitzel HaPoskim, at the end of Chelik Daled, there's a tshuva of Rav Henkin, and a very important tshuva. And Rav Henkin deals with agunois. The other area of Umdena by Dover Shebe'erva is agunois, and primarily after the Holocaust. So I wrote some tshuvas regarding agunois after the Twin Towers came down, after the tsunami in Indonesia. Some of these shaylas came to me. But our generation, the previous generation, dealt with more agunois than probably hundreds of years before, after the Holocaust. So that's when many chidushim came up. Do we rely on a umdena by agunois? The most famous umdena is Haro Mivardon, Rabbi Eliezer Mivardon. Vardon actually is Verona, and he was one of the Bali Toises from Italy, a friend of Toises Rid, Rabbeinu Yeshayahu, a Talmud of Riazoken, and that was Rabbi Eliezer Mivarona, who in the Poskim is called Vardon, And he's quoted in the Mordechai at the end of Yevamah, Siman Tzadik Beis. Rabbi Eliezer Mevardon says, if a husband is lost and a few months transpire, he doesn't come home, we have an Umdena if he would be alive. Why isn't he coming home? Why doesn't he let his wife know he's alive? So the Rama Vardan says, if we know there was a machlokes beineim, there was tension, there was a rift, maybe as a reason he doesn't want to come home. But if they had shalom bayis, the fact that he didn't come home proves that he's no longer alive. Most of the Rishonim rejected that svara totally. And the Mordechai brings different opinions, and the Mordechai brings that one of the Bari Atosis made a cherim not to rely on the Umdena of Rume Vardon. Tumas Adeshan, similar. But he was one of the Gedol Ashkenaz, far away from Italy, younger than Rume Vardon. Tumas Adeshan, Chelik Beisim Akuf Lametes, writes the same Umdena with two differences. Tumas Adeshan relies on the Umdena only if years transpired, and only b'di'evet. If she got married, ein moitzia noisa mebala. The Radbaz is adamantly against the Tumas Adeshan as well, and he says no way could we rely on Umdena by an aguna. 500 years transpired. Shuvas Chasam Soifer Even Ezer Chelek Aleph Nun Ches Samachay, two different Shuvas Chasam Soifer writes. In our day and age, this Umdena is more convincing because we have the post-service, transportation is better. Still, it was a different time. Another 150 years transpired. Igris Moshe Even Ezer Chelek Aleph Memalaf, he says, in our day and age, this Umdena is more convincing. And I say, Igris Moshe 50 years ago is prehistoric. In the days of the internet, in the days of instantaneous information. Today people use their smartphones like they use their eyes. It's crazy, it's insane. Everything you see, you take a picture of. And you send that picture to 1 million people. Today, it would be so unreasonable that a person just got lost and nobody knows where he is. Even the most capable criminal. You can't hide. There is nowhere to hide today. So if the Roma Vardon 900 years ago said this in Umdena, it's more convincing today. Va'af al pikein. We would not rely on this or any other Umdena only as a sniff. If we have more tzedodim, then we rely on Umdenes by agunis. This year is already taking too much time, but there's a machlokes in Achronim regarding the Rume Vardon. The Maharsham, very interesting opinion, the Maharsham says, the Umdena of Rabbi Eliezer Vardon is only when a person fell into the ocean b'mayim she'ein lehem soif. So Chazal say, mayim she'ein lehem soif ishto yasuro. I think the Maharsham makes a lot of sense. Mayim she'ein lehem soif, it's almost impossible that the person is alive. Va'afal pikein osru chachomim. In that case, we rely on the Umdena. Rabbanan Volkan, who was a contemporary of the Maharsham, and his Shuvas in Zakar Nahadan says, no, the Rume Vardon deals with every person that just got lost. We don't know where he is. According to the Maharsham, it makes more sense because this is such a flimsy Umdena. He didn't come home. There could be 1,000 reasons a person is alive and he can't come home. Maybe he was mortally wounded. He's injured. He can't walk. He's disabled. Maybe he's mentally impaired. Maybe he got Alzheimer's. There could be 1,000 reasons a person is alive and we don't know about his whereabouts. And that is why I think, according to the Maharsham, it makes more sense. So this is the sugya of Umdena by Divrei Be'erva. And now Umdena by Yisaveheta, which is the biggest question. We have no sugyas in Shas clearly dealing with Umdena by Yisaveheta, and there's room to argue. Umdena is only when Beis Din needs the tools. Lahamed es adas al tila, but Yisaveheta is personal and everyone's home. Do we rely on Umdenas? two sources which I want to bring. But I want to stress, this sugya is so broad, it is just impossible to be mematzeh. Yefshar lematzot sugya kazu. It touches upon hundreds of different sugyas. But after Piken, I think it's important to define and to be magdi of the fundamentals. Hilchas Malicha, Yordei Samech Tesif Yud. Shulchan Aruch says, a guy that works in a Jewish home, and he prepared meat, and we don't know, did he do melicha or he didn't do melicha? Did he salt the meat? Is it kosher or not? Shulchan Aruch says, if he's Mesiach Lefitumoy, v'yodea minag Yisrael, we could rely that he salted the meat. The Ramah writes, Chodem etarte, either Yodea minag Yisrael or Mesiach Lefitumoy. And the Achronim grapple with the Ramah. The Ramah is mashma, even though he's not Mesiach Lefitumoy, and a guy doesn't have the monas if he's not Mesiach Lefitumoy. If he's Yodea Minig Yisrael, we rely on him. And why? Noide Yehuda, Even Ezer Lamed Aleph Madura Kama, comes up with a chiddush, and he says, which is, I don't think anywhere in the Noide Yehuda we find a similar expression. He says, I have a chiddush, but I didn't think it through enough. And no one could rely on this chiddush, even not as a sniff. And I warn you all, I'm writing this in my tshuva, in my sefer, but don't rely on it, which is uncommon. So why does he write it? He writes, Hashkofa Rishoina, Al Mishkovi Balaylois, Al Bechadrei Mishkovi. I still have to go through. But he does write the chiddush. And he writes, we rely on raglayim ledover and eides nachri, even if it's not Mesiach Lefitumoy. Raglayim ledover would be somewhat similar to Umdena. I think it's not the same words, but it's the same thing, raglayim ledover. The Noida Yehuda says, a guy working in a Jewish home, and he's Yodea Minig Yisrael, it's raglayim ledover. Why not? Why wouldn't he do melicha? He knows it's what we expect of him. He knows that if he doesn't and we catch him, he will pay the price. Raglayim ledover. Writes the Noida Yehuda, the source of this din is in Hilchas Nida, Kuf Pei Zayin. Royedam ach mistashmish. If there's raglayim ledover, the dam stopped, then we rely on the Roifa that says he has the remedy. He knows how to stop. And he testifies that this woman is no longer royedam ach mistashmish. So that's the source. That is the psak of the Ramah. And the Noida Yehuda relies on takonis agunois, raglayim ledover, with the edus of a goy. Comes along the Chassam Sofer, which is also very, very mechodesh. Chelek Aleph, Even Ezer Simen Mem Vav. And the Chassam Sofer writes, oh, the Noida Yehuda is right, warning everyone not to rely on the chiddush because it's really unreliable, and he's wrong. I don't want to go into the details because it's very darkistic details, but this Chassam Sofer is a bit too harsh. And he writes, wow, Nevuah Nizaka boy. The Noida Yehuda was very careful. He writes, don't rely on my chiddush. Chassam Sofer writes, you cannot rely on the chiddush because it's not right. Pischei Tshuva on the spot, Sivkot Membeis, has a totally different feeling than the Chassam Sofer, and he writes, even though this great Gadol said, don't rely on my chiddush, I think we could rely on it as a sniff. And the Noida Yehuda himself, Maduret Inyona, Even Ezer Mem Zayin, does rely on this svor. So, once again, Noida Yehuda explains the Ramah, Hilchas Malicha, Umdena, Raglayim ledover, added on to Eides Nochri. The most mechudesh tshuva in this sugi is an Shloime Kluger. And Shloime Kluger usually is a big machmir. Tuv Tam V'das, Chelek Aleph, Simakuf Ayin Zayin, an unbelievable kula. You need to be Reb Shloime Kluger with this koyach hachidush. Masse shahoyo. There was a certain city in which the Beis Din gave out a isser on shchute chutz. You know what shchute chutz means. Most of the kehillas in Europe, there was a local shchita, And it was prohibited for anybody, any resident in the Jewish community, to bring in meat from elsewhere. You could only use meat from this kela. The primary concern was not kashrus, but the parnasa of the sheikhtim. So the parnasa of the sheikhtim was when people bought meat and there was some added tax on the meat, and that went to the sheikhtim. People wanted to avoid paying that tax, so they tried to bring in meat from other places. So in this certain kela, there was shoimrim. They hired a company, security company, and they stood at the gates of the city, of the town, every night and throughout the day to check the baggage of Jews coming into the city. In Israel, probably in America, but in Israel, in every hospital, there is a security person checking your bag. They don't want to bring in firearms or explosives or... So that kela, there was a shomer. In the middle of the night, they saw a guy with a big sack on his back. And they seemed to realize there's a Jew walking about 10 meters or 20, 30 feet behind him. And he was trying to sneak into the city with that big bag. The Shoimrim cried out to him. They said, "We see you. Come here and put down the bag." He threw away the bag and he ran away. And the Jew that was behind him also ran away. So the Shoimrim took that bag and they found a bag of meat. Is that meat kosher or not? Essentially, the psak of Reb Shlomo Kluger is amazing, and he says, if that goy would have non-kosher meat, what was he afraid of? What was he afraid of? The Jews have no authority preventing goyim to bring in non-kosher meat. They had authority over the Jewish community. You can't bring in kosher meat. But if that goy is bringing non-kosher meat, why did he run away? And why did the Jew run away that was 20 feet behind him? So this is a Umdena Gemura, that this meat is kosher meat. Otherwise, it would be no reason, no way to explain. What was he afraid of? Why did they run away? Why did they throw down this bag? And because some of the pieces of meat had Simone Nikur, Reb Shlomo Kluger is matter the entire bag of meat la'achila. And that is the most extreme example of a umdana lekula by a chashashis diorais. So today, I hope this shiur was interesting. We brought 3 different types of umdenas. We dealt with umdana nefoshes momenes, and then umdana be'erva, primarily kedushin and aguna, 2 different areas. And the climax of the shiur was umdana be'issa be'heter, dealing with 2 different sources. This week's parsha is about Yaakov Avinu's dream. Sula mutzavatzu v'roishay magia shamaymo v'malachei Elokim olim v'yordim bo. So many different interpretations. What was that ladder? And who were those malachim? Why did they go up and why did they come down? The Ramban al Torah quotes the Medrash. That was prophecy. And Yaakov was shown Dalad Malchios, all the great empires that would rise and fall. And that is Olim v'Yordim Boy. Those malach are more indicative of Rome, Persia, Babylon, Edom, this last Golus. And the Sulam is the story of the Jews, the story of the world. Zohar Kodesh has a totally different interpretation. The Sulam is Nishmas Adam. Malach Elokim Olim v'Yordim Boy. We should understand that what we do and what we do not do affects the entire Bria. Chazal teaches every mitzvah a person performs, he creates malachim tovim. Every Aveda brings forth malachim roim, malachei chabola. The malachim are his malachim. They go up and down with him. And that ladder is his neshama. So one interpretation is the historical one. The other one is the musardical one. Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chaim. And Yaakov gets up from that dream, and he is in awe, and he says, the The Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov quote an amazing pshat in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, which once again is in the realm of Musar, of Chasidus, following the fundamental approach of the Zohar. And the Baal Shem Tov says, in this dream, Yaakov was shown and taught the Soidus of Yiras Elokim, of Pnimius HaTorah. So the Gemara says in Shabbos Daf Lamed Aleph, a person that is a lamdin, he has Torah but he lacks Yiras Shamayim. Chazal give a mushal. Chaval al man deles ledarta v'tara ledarta ovid. He doesn't have a house, but he builds a beautiful gate. It's ridiculous. You're such a fool. Why do you need a gate if the gate leads to nowhere? The other side of the door is barren. So Chazal say, person learns a lot of Torah, but if he doesn't have Yiras Shamayim, he has a beautiful gate, but there's nothing behind that gate. Yiras Shamayim, adherence to Hashem's word, performing his mitzvahs, that's the house, that's the palace. Yediyas HaTorah is the gate. So the Baal Shem Tov says, when Yaakov awakens from that dream, he says, Ein zekiyem beis olikim. It is only now that I found the bias. V'zeh, everything I learned by Beis Shem Ve'eva was only Shar HaShamayim. That was merely the gate. And the Baal Shem Tov stresses the importance not only of being a lamdan and a scholar, the importance of Yiras Hashem and Yiras Shamayim and Ahavas Hashem. That's the house, and Torah is the gate. At other opportunities, we will further discuss what's the house and what's the gate. And I think both are equally important, Talmud Torah and Yiras Shamayim. But we'll leave that for another opportunity. Have a wonderful day and have a beautiful Shabbos. And we should share many, many more wonderful hours of our Torah. Kol Tov.